Dan, Nancy, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great to be here.
I was saying earlier, I love the dynamic of interviewing two people at once because even though you both went through the exact same experience, you experience it in different ways, as I know you know.
Yes, absolutely.
And I'm sure over the years, it's tested your relationship in your marriage as well.
Yes. That was one of the things that we learned early on, that men and women approach grief differently. And we had to learn how to deal with our grief before we could grieve together as a couple.
As much as you want to support one another, sometimes I'm sure it feels like you're fighting the battle alone, even though you both went through the same thing.
Exactly. As Dan said, we each had to find our own way, and it was diametrically different. The way that I met my grief was completely different than the way he met his grief. And the way our son, who was 20 at the time, met his grief. And we couldn't come together and begin to comfort each other, let alone help others, until we reached a certain point of being with our own grief.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure it felt three people, you both, and your son, living under the same roof and feeling alone.
Absolutely.
That's a
Yeah.
devastating feeling.
As you said, our marriage definitely was impacted. And the way it felt to me is that grief sort of cracked open our lives and illuminated all the places in my personal life, as well as our marriage, that needed some attention.
Before we jump into the full story and how grief looks for men versus women, if you can tell our audience a little bit of background on how you lost your daughter, just to give people a little bit of the history and kind of maybe the year it happened and how long it's been, that kind of thing.
It was November of 2000. She was 17 and a senior in high school. She hit a tree on the way to school, and she was in the hospital for 5 days. She really never regained consciousness because they put her in an medically induced coma because of brain swelling. So we spent a 5-day vigil in the hospital, hoping for the best.
And when we realized that the best was more than we could hope for, all of her high school friends who had gathered to show their concern and their love, we realized at that point that there was work to do. We didn't know what that work was going to be, but we did take it upon ourselves to invite her friends in to say goodbye. And that was such a strong experience for us that we still get thank yous from her friends to this day, 20 years later, that impacted their lives, how they approached loss themselves, and was really a gift in the moment. And Nancy has a story about how do you perceive gift from grief.
That sounds like an oxymoron for me. And I'm
Yeah,
sure a lot
exactly.
of people getting a gift
Exactly.
from grieving.
Right.
What does that even mean, Nancy?
I thought the same thing when I first realized that I was receiving gifts, which initially came into my life as blessings and grace. I thought, well, I don't deserve to receive a gift. My daughter has died. And eventually I came to see that the blessings and grace of the gifts were exactly what I needed to continue on this journey. One example is one day I was running errands. This was probably 2 years after Leah died. And I needed gas, so I pulled into a gas station. And Leah's favorite teacher happened to pull in right after I did. She got out of the car, we hugged. We hadn't seen each other since Leah's memorial service. And she told me about changes she had made in her life because of knowing Leah. And I realized that was the gift she was giving me, telling me something about my daughter that I didn't know. And we would often hear stories about Leah, that how she was always there for her friends and how she was always the first one that they called because they knew she was really going to not just be there for them, but listen to them. And so there again, we got to learn a little bit more about our daughter because let's face it, at 17,
you don't know her as much.
We don't know her as well. And
especially, I'm sure, the few years leading up to that, or the difficult years.
Exactly. It was a very tumultuous time, especially between her and
I. Don't I know it, Nancy?
And I was just beginning to see glimmers of that starting to change. She would say, "You want to hang out with me on Saturday?" And I would think,
you'd be shocked.
talking to me. And she meant for like a half an hour, but still, it was the light at the end of the tunnel, and then the tunnel collapsed.
Yeah. If you can bring me back to that morning, how did you find out? I guess there's a car crash of Leah, and then I guess an ambulance or
Yeah.
police officer is calling you.
Well,
Well, at that time, we were both working and we would alternate. I would wake her one morning, get her started for school. Nancy would do the next day. And it was because of traffic and, split schedules that, we would do it. It happened to be my day and it happened to be a Friday. And I knocked on her door and, it's like, yeah, are you ready? Are you up? Are you, getting
You're
ready?
bringing me back.
Yeah, yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm up. He said, okay, well, I'm headed to work now. And, okay. So, I got in the car, fighting traffic, getting to the job site. And an hour or so later, we got a phone call.
I was working at NIH in Bethesda at the time in Maryland, and the campus police came into my office and they asked me if I was Nancy Loeffler, and I said yes. And they said, your daughter's been in an accident, please come with us. So I asked them questions, and of course I was getting no answers. Then I called Dan and told him that the campus police were taking us to the county line of the hospital she was in. So he met us there. So we traveled to the hospital. It was, I don't know, mid-morning by the time we got there, because she was on her way to school. So it was, I don't know, 8-ish when it happened. By the time she got to the hospital, we found out it was mid-morning. So we got to the hospital and were met by her principal and her guidance counselor, looking very grim. And they told us that she had been in, and that was the first time we found out exactly what happened. We both asked the police officers whose car we were in what happened, and nobody would tell us anything. So
That's the worst moment.
it was horrible.
Just not knowing.
It was a horrible ride to the hospital. So they told us that she had been in a car accident on her way to school. She hit a tree, and it happened to be the only tree in the middle of a cornfield. So she was in surgery. So we had to wait to see her, and that's when we called our son Peter, who was at college, luckily about an hour away. So he joined us, and after she got out of surgery, we were able to see her, but she was never conscious, but we could talk to her because of the brain swelling. Yeah,
The worst call you probably will ever get.
the worst call. And then the worst decision is 5 days later, without any brain activity, having to make the decision to remove life. And that was a brutal decision to make as well, because as Dan said at the time, her friends were gathering at the hospital, our friends were gathering at the hospital, our son was there, and everybody wanted to know when she was coming home. And
What is that
yeah,
decision like, though? So if you continue to leave her on life support, what does that mean? Or like why do you have to make the decision after a certain amount of time?
Well, it was,
Is it a cost thing? Like you just keep like what
oh,
is it?
no, it was a surprise because they came to us and they said, did you know that your daughter was an organ donor? And
in a moment, we didn't forget.
I
We
had
didn't
I
forget.
had taken her for her license, and she was really a new driver. And that was one of the things that we kind of contribute to her, responding the way she did during the accident. Between our house and school, it was a country road and it was winding. And the accident site, there was evidence that she had hit the shoulder of the road, went to correct, and then started spinning and then hit the tree. It was kind of the side impact that dented the car, threw her into the, side of the vehicle and banged her around pretty good.
So the organ donor people at the hospital approached us about that. And that was one factor in, if she truly was going to be an organ donor, we needed to make that decision. Now, we could have made the decision to keep her on life support in case there was going to be some miracle. And when we sat with that, we realized that the right decision was she wasn't going to come back to us. With all of the evidence and talking to the doctors, we knew that wasn't going to happen. So
And that wouldn't have been her,
that would have been her choice too.
right, as full of life as she was. And for us, that was the wrong decision. And as a result of our decision, 7 people Was
Yeah,
it?
she donated her heart, her pancreas, her kidney, her liver, the only one, and veins in her legs.
Wow. So she
Yeah,
saved 7 other lives because of it.
right. Yeah.
Does that give you any bit of closure?
Not at the time.
No, I
That-
bet.
It was a hard
You're still
decision.
angry probably.
Well, it
I'm
was.
sure this is how I would feel. I would feel, especially if it was someone else's kids, I'd feel like happy for you, sad for me. Like I'm
Yeah.
glad you're happy, but it's because I lost that you're happy. That's how I would
Right.
feel.
Yeah, that's even though it was so hard, it was my heart. We made that heart, and I know that was an initial feeling. We eventually came to realize, and I wrote letters to the recipients. In the case of her heart, the recipient's mother, it was a 9-year-old girl at the time. And on the other hand, I remember thinking that if someone had offered a brain transplant, which I know wasn't possible, but if someone had offered it, I would have been right there saying yes and want
Yeah.
that. So I came to accept it eventually. It took a few years.
It's tough. And especially I find those, not that I've experienced it myself, but what I assume is in those moments where the doctor's asking you to make a decision, this is not a couple day decision. Like they want to know now.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there is a time frame that
Right.
they
For
have
the
to work.
organs.
Yeah. So that was one of the, between making the decision and then deciding to honor the wishes, even though, I mean, they were her wishes. So we were going to honor it. And it was also very difficult for us.
What are the logistics of that? Like, I'm assuming if she's an organ donor, they're probably taking her body for a few days. So it's probably delaying any type of memorial or anything that you can do, which is
Yeah.
pretty heartbreaking.
It is. That was also heartbreaking because we left the hospital on a Wednesday night and they didn't harvest food. At the time, they called it harvesting, but we just recently heard they don't call it that
What do
anymore.
they call it now?
And then after that, there was a lot of questions that we had to answer about her lifestyle and things like that. And so it took a while before they released the body.
One thing I'd like to add, because this is pretty heavy, and that had to do with the morning before we had to make this decision, before we were faced or even approached by the hospital team. That morning, we drove into the hospital parking lot, and it was a parking structure. And we were on the second or third floor. And we knew at that point in time that as every day went on, the chances of her coming back were less and less. And as we parked the car and got out and headed to the stairwell, I opened the stairwell to find a little sparrow flying around inside the stairwell, terrified, trapped, and very afraid. And as Nancy and started down the stairs, I held the door open and I said, "It's time for you to be free, little sparrow." And with that, bird looked at me and saw the door open and out she went. It was at that moment that I knew she wasn't going to come back. And
Yeah, I knew it too. We didn't vocalize it to each other.
We
couldn't.
both knew.
We couldn't. Yeah, that was when we knew.
Where's your
And
son
so-
with all of this? Did he have to
He-
go back to
he-
college?
No, we had gone home that night to try to get a better night's sleep. He had stayed with her. So he was with her. He stayed in the hospital for that night. And he said he was reminding her of childhood memories and singing songs to her. And so it was just a real special time for him as well.
Mm-hmm.
It helped us to make that decision and to understand that it was a sign, if you want to call it that, or for reinforcing the wish that she be set free. As difficult as that was, it felt like the right decision for us.
And you both agreed at the same time? Your son did too?
There was conversation after the donor person left us with the decision that, we had to talk through, but we all agreed at that point that, this was what she would have wanted.
We all knew on some level that was the right decision.
What breaks my heart about losing people young, I mean, gives you a huge reminder of morality, first of all. But
Yeah.
secondly, it's no 16, 17-year-old is doing a will or kind of letting you know if anything happens, this is kind of my wishes. No
Right.
one's thinking about that. Even I know my own parents are not thinking about that yet. And
Exactly.
you as much as you want to be like, yeah, this is probably what she would have wanted. None of us ever know. But I think,
Right.
like you said, a good sign of her being an organ donor on the driver's license. I mean, when you're given the
Right.
opportunity, you know that is what she wanted.
Yeah, and it was still ultimately our decision because
Yeah,
she was under 18, and
exactly.
that was not what we were gonna do. We were gonna honor her wishes. The other thing you said, no 16 or 17-year-old leaves a will. I also realized that her friends, being that age, have no context
None.
for how to grieve, how to face this loss in their lives. And so
Does
one of the
anyone ever?
well,
Until they
nobody does.
Right.
yeah,
Exactly. And that's one of the things that as we try to change the conversation among grief is to teach people resources to meet grief when it arises
mhm,
along the way so that when the big griefs come, we at least have a place to start. It's not going to make it easier because we still have to go through those difficult and painful feelings. But having resources can make a big difference.
And those kinds of things are that can prepare you for bigger griefs, or loss of a job, loss of a relationship,
Health changes, loss of a pet.
loss of a pet. Yeah.
Yeah, or you often give the example of losing your little league game where you're 7. To a 70-year-old, that's huge.
that's devastating.
Yeah, and yes, so teaching how to meet those
Deal
difficult
with
feelings,
loss in general.
how to deal with loss in general. And I witnessed 3 generations, all mother, daughter, daughter. And the grandmother was telling the daughter not to be sad. And the mother said, it's okay if she's sad. And I wanted to cheer and say, yes, we need to teach our children how to be sad because it's a better way.
I grew up being taught to bury emotions. So
Mhm.
I'm 28 years old, still trying to unravel that and unlearn those
Yeah,
things.
yeah, yeah. And we were, 48 when our daughter died. And we had to unravel a lot of it. And I had gone through the death of my parents. And it was devastating, but not as devastating as.
As losing, well, no
Yeah,
one
yeah,
expects to lose their children. Like no one
exactly.
expects to see them pass before they do.
Exactly.
I've seen loss in my life. I've had grandparents pass and stuff. I remember growing up, I was in grade 9 and my friend in grade 10, she passed suddenly. It was the first day of school and her mom or her sister went to check up on her the night before the first day of school. I think she was just getting ready and she was passed on her bed. Done.
Wow.
15 years old. And an uncle of mine passed very young. And I know my grandmother, his mom at the time, similar probably experience that you guys went through where you do not expect to lose your kids. And
Right.
from what I gather, those losses is if you allow it, it can eat you alive. Like
Yeah,
sometimes if you could be next where you just almost like let it go, like the
absolutely.
grief takes over. That's what I've gathered from just listening to other people's stories. And what breaks my heart, and tell me if you guys had this situation. I know when Dan and I were talking, he kind of gave light to this. Did you find, because I found before when I've lost my grandmothers before, there was months and months and months where I would go pick up the phone and dial the number, and it wouldn't hit me until I got, like, the dial tone. I'm like, "Oh, right." Like, did you find that happen where you almost, like, went into her bedroom or, like, looked forward to celebrations and you're like, "Oh, wait, like, she's not here anymore."
Yeah, yeah, and she was at that age where she was out with her friends a lot, so we were used to her not physically being there. So it was hard to remember that she wasn't gone, and yet there were still times when I would think she's gonna come bounding around the corner because she was a bounder,
Yeah.
especially at Christmas time. The first Christmas, it was still pretty raw, and we had family out to help us through, but the following Christmas, we thought we would do things the same way we always did. We didn't know any different. So Peter came home from school, our son, and we put up the Christmas tree, and he was home for a week, and it was like we kept expecting Leah to come bounding around the corner, and he stayed in his room all week, and it
Wow.
was the worst experience. And
Sad
after
Christmas.
that, we realized that we needed to change things up. So we started traveling at Christmas time.
Mm.
So
Just to make new traditions.
it's to make new traditions. Yeah.
One question I have is what surprised you of how differently both of you and your son grieved based on gender, based on a parent versus a sibling, age, perhaps? Like, what surprised you about how 3 of you grieved differently?
First of all, it surprised me that we did because
Yeah.
we were the same person, right? Shouldn't we all have the same experience? But that's how I think. I know you didn't think that way. I guess another surprise was that Peter went back to school and just really thrived at school. Keeping busy at that time worked for him.
But
Keeping
did you
busy.
see that as him not remembering his sister and kind of seeing it as the past?
No,
Okay.
no.
You knew that his grief was being channeled to something else.
Yeah,
And that he had a good support system that he could rely on when he was feeling down and we weren't there because we weren't far away. We were an hour away, but he didn't want to impose his grief on us because he knew that we were in our own grief at the time. And because we each were grieving differently and separately, we didn't talk about it. We or initially, there was a couple of years really before we could
Yeah.
release.
What did grief look like in those first few years?
yeah. For me, I initially had no idea how I was going to move forward. I didn't know how I was going to be able to get out of bed again. I didn't know how I was.
You thought
going
this
to-
is the end for me.
Yeah, I didn't know how I was going to be able to stop eating chocolate chip cookies because that's what kept me from feeling my pain. And 2 weeks after she died, I mean, it was literally, I can still remember where I was and how this message came in. I heard a message that said, losing Leah is too high a price to not live the life you were meant to. And that has stayed with me since that day. And that saved my life because I didn't know what it was at the time, but I knew that I needed to find a way to excavate that life. That's how I usually describe it in order to honor my daughter. And that
It's easier to do
became-
nothing though, Nancy, and just be sad.
Yeah, but it also meant learning how to be sad, learning
Yeah.
how to meet unsaid feelings, which first of all meant stopping eating those chocolate chip cookies, or as many.
Can we do
Um,
both?
yeah, but learning how to meet our feelings. And so I turned to a practice that was already a part of my life at the time to do that. And that's a present moment awareness practice called samyama, which helped me to meet the pain of losing my daughter without all the stories, all the what ifs. You know, if only I had been a better mother, I could have kept her safe. If I would slice and dice that story over and over and over again to try to get a different outcome.
You're
And it
taking
wasn't
the
gonna happen.
blame where there's nothing you could have or couldn't have
Exactly.
done.
That's how I met my grief. I began to learn how to get better at feeling my feelings. And when I saw how powerful, that's when I would receive those blessings and grace, the gifts that I talked about earlier. Each time I would come into my heart and allow my heart to hold the feelings, the blessings and grace would come in. When I saw how powerful this practice was at helping me meet my grief, and mind you, I had been doing this for a while, so it's a practice that it is good for everyday life, not just grief. It's just what I turned to. I became certified as a samyama practitioner in 2009, and that's primarily what I use with my clients. So I work very intuitively. We start with the present moment, and we go from there. I have other strategies that actually what happened is everything that I did for myself, I crafted that into a body of work that I now use with my clients.
Okay.
And it's a very intuitive way of working. And we always start with what's here now.
Right. And what about you, Dan? How did grief look like at the beginning?
Nothing like, uh,
So are you saying Nancy like took her grief and put it in action?
yes, very much. I mean, she began working because she already had something established. I fell under the pressure of having to get back to normal, not
Mhm.
realizing that normal was never going to be there. And
What was normal like
Yeah, exactly. I went back to work.
quickly after?
3 weeks. We both went to work back 3 weeks.
Yeah. And I took all of those feelings, those emotions that I didn't want to deal with, and I put them in a little box and I stuck it on the shelf and I said, I'll deal with that later. I got to get back to work because I got to, I got to
Do this,
And
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm too busy to grieve.
Well, convince myself to stay busy so that I didn't have to. And, to do all of the other things that men are told are the right thing. Pick up your burden and shoulder on, grieve alone. I couldn't share my feelings right then. My heart was broken, but I couldn't. I had to be strong for everyone to take the condolences that people wanted to give us and have that strong, brave face while inside, my heart was broken.
Yeah.
And
You think your son felt the same way being a guy?
Yeah, I do.
To some extent, yeah.
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 I don't know that he had the same
Awareness.
having to provide for the family, having to,
Yeah.
make sure
That
that,
pressure.
We
right.
didn't have those pressures.
So, yeah, he had the pressures of school and the pressures of, that he was dealing with.
Of taking care of us, it was all on him. He did share that with us at some point.
So
Yeah.
how long after did you guys start grieving together and realizing that this is both our daughter? Like, we're going through the same thing, because it sounds like you were grieving alone and just kind of living a parallel life for a little bit.
Yeah, it was. It was at least 3 or 4 years.
Wow. I bet
Yeah,
your
it was
marriage
a
was
long
tested
time.
all those
Well,
years.
And early on, though, we, made the decision. We weren't going to make any changes
Yeah.
that, to the point where we didn't touch her room. We didn't make it a shrine,
No.
but we didn't.
There was no pressure to go through her stuff. There was no pressure to do anything. But we also talked about it. We didn't shut all that part of our lives out. We talked about her, all 3 of us did, and we just somehow knew that we couldn't support each other, or we could support each other by letting each other walk our own path. It was not something that we consciously thought about.
Do you
No.
think not doing anything with her room and kind of leaving the house as it was is the healthy way to go?
For a while, yeah, because
Okay.
making those decisions when
Too hasty.
it's too hasty. And when we did make that decision, I brought in someone who didn't know her to help me get rid of things because she didn't have any emotional attachment to it. On the other hand, I also invited friends in, take what they wanted.
Oh, that's beautiful. What did people take? Like photos or anything?
Jewelry. I mean, I took the jewelry that I wanted, but jewelry, a few photos. We had a lot of photos, pieces of clothing, other little
Yeah.
mementos that she may have had.
You got me thinking, if I pass now, what are people going to take from me?
Really?
I better go through everything and hide the stuff that no one needs.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's always I always think about this, like to add a little bit of a lighter note, it's like if you do pass suddenly, it's like, what am I wearing that day? Where am I? Like, what was the last thing I said to people? Like all those things,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that,
I'm sure
we
you
try-
guys thought of, like your
Yeah.
last conversation with her.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I can still picture it.
I hope yours wasn't a fight, Nancy.
No, it wasn't.
Okay,
She
good.
was going to homecoming the next day.
Uh-huh.
She was getting her hair done. So she already had her homecoming dress. We had gone out for that. So
In the last conversation, though, she came around the corner, was headed down to her room, and was like, "I'm going to bed. I love you," and off she went. And
You almost wish you had that as a recording.
yeah.
oh
Yeah.
gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the other things, knocking on the door, and that next
That was
morning,
that was your very last.
yeah, and hearing, yeah, I'm okay, and then Nancy was saying about the what ifs and if onlys, and the shame that I felt.
Maybe if I
Uh,
just drove her to school that day, maybe if I just let her sleep in, and you
Right.
run your brain all day.
Yeah.
Still
Yeah.
times you're doing it today, 21 years later.
Right.
And so again, that was the reason I had to package it, because I just could
couldn't
not
face
deal with
that,
it.
yeah. Yeah. And I have to say that I never blamed Dan because I knew
There's no one to blame. There's
was
literally
blame.
nothing you could have done.
No, but I've been asked that question. Since he
Really?
was working on, no, I don't blame anyone.
No.
Because he did that a million times. That was our routine.
Mm-hmm.
Years later, as a matter of fact, not that too long ago, I did get confirmation from a medium that she would have come back to her body if her body would have supported her spirit. It didn't, and she was sorry that she had to leave. And she's always around us, so it was like a huge gift.
Is that the only time you've been to a medium? And if not, like, what else have you heard?
That is the only time I've been to a medium. I was afraid.
I think
didn't
they're
let her
so
know
cool.
for a long time. But then
What else did you hear in that session about her?
that she has been reason we moved to St. Paul was to be near our son who
Had a
just
daughter?
recently had a daughter. So Leah, our daughter, has come to see her niece often and is happy that we were moving closer so that she didn't have to go so far
Cute.
to visit each of us. Yeah. And that she really is enjoying watching her brother be a father.
Right.
So that was touching.
I want to ask you more about that. That's what I was going to ask you earlier is, How hard was it watching your son have a daughter and knowing that your daughter could have her own kids, like watching your son get married, that kind of thing? Was
Yeah.
there a part of you that it hurt to be happy because you knew you were supposed to have another kid that goes through all of this as well?
Not for him. It was harder to go to Leah's friends' weddings
Mm,
as they got married,
'cause
you
that
know,
was the years, yeah, because
because
you would have went
yeah,
through those things with your son regardless, yeah.
exactly. As a matter of fact, when I met my granddaughter for the first time, she was 3 weeks old. She was this little tiny thing, and my heart just burst open with joy.
Mhm.
And as I was reflecting on that, I realized that I would not have been able to meet her that way if I hadn't met my grief the way that I did, because it would have been too many layers of protection in my heart. I would have
Absolutely.
been happy. I wouldn't have been so open and so joyful and able to be with her the way that I am. So that's another reason why doing grief work is so important, because it prepares you for things you don't even know are coming down the road. It prepares you for life.
I feel like this is a course we should be doing in school.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we don't. We learn how to grieve by observing our parents and friends.
And if those are bad examples, we're doomed.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
The whole reason that we want to have these conversations is to help normalize the fact that, grief is a normal thing. It is going to happen
We're
to you.
human.
And, if you can take those lessons and build your toolbox, then you are not going to be as devastated. And other cultures deal with grief in a variety of ways. An
Better than
example,
ours, I would imagine.
yeah, yeah. One of the things that I remember as a child growing up was when my great grandmother passed away. It was an in-home funeral. It was a 3-day celebration of her life, and it wasn't sad. The reason it was 3 days is they had to come in from out of town, but it was an open house.
Yeah.
And I remember
Like a
there
party
was,
almost.
it was, people were bringing in food, and I must have been 3 or 4. I could fit underneath the tables, not
Cute.
without ducking. It was such a different experience from when my parents died, and the formalized going to the funeral parlor and having
Stuffy,
all,
it's cold.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, we've formalized the process so much. We've done work in senior living facilities. And when a death occurs in one of those places, it's always Joe died, taking him out the back door. And,
Yeah.
and
Rather than taking him down the hall so that everyone
And
can honor it.
celebrate.
Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
I think the idea of death being a celebration is a weird concept,
Yeah. Well,
but I think it's more you should celebrate their life.
right.
celebrate the life. And this has really taught us the importance of celebrating life, of living your life to the fullest now, because you don't know what's going on.
You never know.
Right.
In saying that, how are you still celebrating Leah to this day? Like, I know you changed a lot of traditions. Do you still
Yeah.
celebrate maybe her birthday? Do you do anything or
Yeah. On her birthday, we'll usually do something. She was a huge ice cream fan. So we'll
cute?
go get ice cream. We do different things different years, because one of the things that I realized with facing holidays or milestone days, no matter what they are, you feel differently every year. So
Does it get
rather
better?
than, it gets different.
Because a
Yeah,
lot of people say time will heal everything. Does it?
Yeah, that's a myth. That's one myth, I believe. Because time heals. It depends what you're doing with that time.
Okay.
A good example is if I broke my arm and didn't do anything with it, in time it would heal somehow, but I wouldn't be able to use it the same way that I can if I had put a splint on it or taken whatever. So it's what you do at that time. And
Right.
yes, it's still painful. I mean, I can still be taken back to that time and still have some of those same devastating feelings that I had. I now have the resources to work through them.
Right.
And now we can talk about them. Luckily, at least recently, we haven't each had them at the same time. But if we do, we're okay with that.
You said the phrase grief work. What does grief work look like? And what does this toolbox that you speak of look like?
Yeah.
Knowing me, I have none of the tools. I think I have an empty toolbox. So give me a couple tools to start with.
Well, one of them is learning how to feel all your feelings. And there's The way I teach is one way. There's many different ways to get used to feeling your feelings. We don't like to feel them because they're painful or uncomfortable, and we think that we have to be happy all the time. And we can't be happy unless we work through the difficult ones. So it's learning how to get better at feeling. It's taking care of yourself. Self-care, we hear about self-care all the time. What does it mean when you're grieving someone? It's different. For me, it was eating food that nourished my body instead of all those chocolate chip cookies, and then finding some kind of movement that supports where I'm at too. Another thing I teach is grief movement. So it's first of all becoming aware of where in the body the feelings are, and then moving them through with sound, movement, and creativity. Finding out what connects you to who you are, because that will help you to move the grief through as well. What are some of yours?
Well,
Even if you did have the tools, you're not allowed to use them as a man. Society tells us that.
right. And what I found and what has worked for me was to come across the grief recovery method, which was a practice started 40 years ago and that appealed to me as an engineer. And it was more logical. It dealt with graphs and picturing this thing like from 40,000 feet, yeah, I lost that baseball game when I was 7. And what did I do about it? Or I didn't get, winner of the spelling bee championship, or, all of those little things that occurred over the course of my life. I began to realize that, oh yeah, grief is there. And the grief recovery method helped me to kind of quantify that and then give weight to it when you draw a line and, this is the first experience of grief and this is where I am today. And, oh, this is a big grief. And this is a little grief. You begin to picture, I could picture in my mind these things and then deal with the things that I never had a chance to say or express, the things that I needed to apologize for. No, and apologies comes hand in hand with things that I need forgiveness for. And when you forgive somebody for leaving you, either it's a relationship or it's, your child or your partner or your parent, that's a great release because forgiveness is really something you're giving to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And the things that I may have wanted to apologize for that I never had a chance to say because, gee, she's no longer here.
Right.
But I can say those things and I can work through them and come to a place where I feel that I've completed all of the things that I needed to say that I never had a chance to say. And that lifted my heart and allowed me to move forward in my life in much the same way Nancy said. And I use some of her practices just in my life, on a daily basis, because I found that sitting with the feelings and then, maybe doing some writing can help. It was something I never would have done, before this happened.
Something just occurred to me. Do you think that for men, giving them permission in these feelings is
Yes, definitely.
Who gives those permission though? Maybe their partner, maybe a female in general, like themselves. Who's telling them it's okay?
we do?
Yeah,
As a grief recovery specialist, Dan can tell his client that it's
got
give
it.
him permission to feel that way.
And I can say that to somebody, but until they are ready to receive that and
They need to make the choice and decision.
Give themselves
Exactly.
permission. So
Yeah.
you give them permission to give themselves permission.
right. Yeah.
I have a few last questions for you. So, the first one being in the work that you do today with helping other people learn how to grieve, who in general comes to you? Is it usually people who's lost like a loved one or something? Like, how do people find you?
Most people find me through past clients. So it's
Yeah.
definitely referrals and word of mouth. And it's usually someone who isn't early in the grief journey, although I have had those clients as well. For me, it's someone who is asking, where's my grief journey? There's
Yeah.
got to be more.
So they feel like I've been like living in this sadness and not dealing with it for so long. Like I got to
Right.
do something about this. They're almost at their wits' end.
Yeah.
And I guess it helps them a lot because I always say this to a lot of people. It's easy to be a specialist in something or a coach in something, but if you haven't gone through it yourself, your clients, you have no idea what your clients are feeling. So I'm sure they feel all the empathy from you, and they love that you're able to understand them.
Yeah. And we also tell them that each grief experience is unique and that
Mhm.
you can't compare and there's no competition. My grief is no stronger or more grievous than your
Right.
grief.
Right. Everybody's grief visits them when it does, and
At
it
100%.
100%.
Yeah.
Right. Our son's cat just died, and it just broke
Breaks
our heart.
everyone's heart.
He's just such a good friend and a good companion, and just a wise soul, and we're still all really,
And some people might look at that and be like, "Oh my god, get over it. It's just a cat." And that's so insensitive.
yeah.
Yeah, especially when they have given you unconditional love
Mhm.
and they are like your best buddies,
It's like having
but
another kid.
yeah,
Yeah.
yes, in a way, yeah.
Yeah.
The other one of the last questions I have for you both is, what does grief look like today for both of you? Obviously, it's been 21 years later, and I'm sure it still shows
Yeah.
up in some ways. It's never ending, but obviously it gets better, as you both know, in different ways. It's just different. You just change your life differently, but how does it still show up today?
It shows up in sadness that Leah's not here to meet her niece in person or to be here with us. Just not be able to hug her. That
Yes.
those person hugs or be able to share milestones in her life. Sometimes it's just like a really strong feeling of sadness or yearning or
The song that was playing on the radio when
Oh,
she popped into the room,
yeah,
those,
when you hear it again, yeah.
associative memory thing.
yeah, the tunes that you would hear on summer vacation when we were off by the lakeside.
You don't
And
realize you have that memory until the sound or the
so it comes
smell
in.
or
Yeah.
yeah, it comes
Yeah.
out.
Well, and yeah, and those associative memories can be the triggers of the grief, like,
Yeah.
because associative memories can come in and just like bring you back.
Yeah.
Like putting that one ornament on the tree that was always hers to put on the tree. You just
just
catch
break.
yourself. It's like, oh my God,
Yeah.
I'm sure you think you have this grief solved, but then you hear that one song, you're like, "Oh, yeah, it's still deep and heavy."
heavy, but it's bittersweet,
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's been sweet and it connects us to her. And because I know she's around,
Mhm.
I just talk to her all the time.
That's
She
good.
used to send me songs. First, I don't know, a couple of years, she used to send me all these songs, and I knew they were from her because I would get that feeling, and it was just like they were coming into my heart. So that was one of the first ways we stayed connected early on. We have a picture up here. If someone asks us a question about our children, we always say we have two.
Really?
Uh,
Nice.
yeah. Yeah, we keep her memory alive, and we're not afraid to talk about her or
Good.
have ask us about her. Yeah.
The first time that I knew she was still around and with us was we were still back in Maryland, and in the backyard we had a swimming pool, and there was a tree that was near that provided shade for the deck. And I walked down there to, clean the filter and be busy,
Yeah.
and out of the tree fell a little baby squirrel. And when Thea was a little bigger than our granddaughter is now,
Yeah.
she couldn't say squirrel. It was Quirlo.
It is a hard word.
Yeah. And this little squirrel fell out of the tree, hit the ground, shook itself, looked up at me, and then scurried away. And I
You
thought
just
of
knew.
Yeah.
there's her squirrel,
Yeah.
squirrelo,
Her
you know.
Solo.
And to me, it was just her saying, "Hi, Dad."
Yeah,
Yeah.
hi. Oh, I love that. It's always
Yeah.
those little things that you're least suspecting. For my
Yeah.
mom, whenever she sees butterflies, she knows my great grandmother is around for sure because she just always had butterflies in her house, whether it was like a little figurine or I don't know, there was always a butterfly somewhere. So that's kind of hers.
Yeah.
But she always gives her that feeling of like, okay, you're around. And
Yeah.
you need that to kind of live on, I
Right.
find.
Yeah. And if you're open to it, they show up.
They show up.
And they're just great reminders, not that she's ever far from our minds, but when things like that happen, it just reinforces her presence in a different way.
The last question I have for you both. What's a little piece of advice or a tip or words of wisdom that you would like to leave the audience with if they have lost a loved one recently?
Be gentle with yourself, and you're not ready till you're ready.
Mm,
All this stuff that we're talking about is important, and you're not ready until you're ready.
mhm.
And continue to honor yourself and where you are in your journey.
What's something you wish
Eh,
you would have heard when you were going through it?
That suffering doesn't serve us, and that find something that works for you, and to be willing to face your grief, and healing is possible.
Mm. My heart goes out to you so much. It's been 2 decades now, and, like, I
Yeah.
know it doesn't get any easier, so I wish she was still here for you both, but everything you guys are doing for your clients now, you're serving in a different way, and I know there's so many lives you've both touched to show them how to get through everything that you've already been through, so there's some glimmer of hope.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks. Yeah.
You're welcome, and thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure to have you both, and I hope that some of your story resonates with some of our listeners.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. They can reach us at www.beingwithgrief.com. And we look forward to having a conversation. And like I said, no need to hold it all inside. We're not meant to be pressure cookers and have that work inside, because if we don't release that, it can create stress and pain and suffering that we don't need
And affect our health.
and affect your health. Yeah.
I've also written a book about my experience, which is going to be found on my website.
And is it published already?
Published, yeah.
Nice. What's it called?
The Alchemy of Grief, Your Journey to Wholeness. It's also available on Amazon.
Perfect. I will add those to the show notes so everyone can check it out.
Thank you.
Thank you to you both.